Go to sleep already. My luxury guests are arriving now, and I don't want any obstacles in the living room. Robert yelled at me, pushing me by the shoulder
Thank you
toward the
so
dark
much
hallway
for being here.
while I was still
Your
holding the
support
kitchen
means
rag.
the world to me.
My name is Eleanor.
Thank you
I am
so much
68
for
years
being
old,
here. Your
and I have
support
spent a
means the world
decade
to me.
baking the bread that other
Thank
people
you
eat.
so much for being
What he didn't
here.
know
Your
is that the
support
key
means
to the
world
pantry
to me.
and the weight of this house
Thank you
have
so much for
always
being
been in my
here.
pocket.
Your
It
support
had all
means the
started
world
many
to me.
hours earlier, at
Thank
4 in the
you
morning,
so much for being
when the
here.
December
Your
cold was still
support means
slipping
the
through
world
the
to me.
cracks of the kitchen
Thank you
windows.
so much for being
At that
here.
hour, the
Your
house was
support
plunged
means the
into
world to me.
absolute silence.
Thank you
It was
so
the only
much
time
for
of
being
day when
here.
I felt this
Your
place
support
belonged to
means
me
the
again.
world to me.
I got out of bed
Thank
with
you
the usual
so
pain
much
in
for
my
being here.
knees,
Your
a dull
support
ache
means the
that's
world to
accompanied me for years,
Thank
but
you
which I
so
learned to
much for
ignore
being here.
because
Your
work doesn't
support
wait
means
for
the
the
world to
ailments of
me.
the old.
Thank
I
you
put on my
so
worn
much for
slippers.
being here.
I tied
Your
the wool
support
robe my
means the
late
world to
husband,
me.
Arthur, gave me on our
Thank you
last Christmas
so
together,
much for being here.
and I walked
Your
slowly
support
toward my
means the world
territory.
to me.
The kitchen was
Thank
freezing,
you
but it
so
would
much for
soon warm
being
up.
here. Your
I turned on
support
the
means the
fluorescent
world
light,
to me.
which flickered a
Thank you
couple of
so
times
much
before
for being
illuminating
here.
the white
Your
tiles.
support means the world
On the
to
centre
me.
island, immense and
Thank you
pale,
so much for
waited the
being here.
22-pound
Your
turkey
support
I
means
had
the
set
world
out to
to
thaw
me.
since Tuesday.
Thank you
Next to
so
it, a
much for
massive
being
pork
here.
roast
Your
wrapped in
support
plastic
means the
awaited
world
its
to me.
turn. 20 people.
Thank you so
That was
much
the
for
number
being
Robert,
here.
my
Your
son-in-law,
support
had
means
dropped
the
last
world to
week
me.
with the same casualness of someone asking for a glass of water. 20 people from his firm, the new partners, the investors who were going to change his life according to him. I washed my hands with ice-cold water and bar soap, feeling my knuckles go numb. I grabbed my blue apron, the one with edges frayed from so many washes, and tied it around my waist. That knot was my battle uniform. I started with the marinade, peeling whole heads of garlic, grinding black pepper, squeezing bitter oranges until the acid burned a small cut on my index finger. I threw it all in the blender with a good splash of cheap white wine, apple cider vinegar, cumin, dried oregano I had sun-dried myself, and a handful of coarse salt. The roar of the motor broke the early morning silence, but I knew no one upstairs was going to wake up. They are heavy sleepers, the sleep of those who know someone else is awake, holding up the world for them. I rubbed the turkey with the mixture, sliding my hands under the cold skin, massaging the meat so the flavour would penetrate right down to the bone. It's physical, heavy work. My wrists protested with every movement, but I kept going. I was thinking about Arthur. He used to get up with me at this hour. He would sit in the corner chair with a cup of black coffee and keep me company. He didn't cook, but he handed me the knives. He told me bad jokes in a low voice, so as not to wake our daughter Valerie. And when the turkey was ready to go into the oven, he was the one who lifted it with his strong arms. Now, Arthur has been 6 feet under for 5 years, and I had to learn to lift the weight alone, literally. With an effort that pulled a groan from my chest, I lifted the aluminum roasting pan and slid it into the preheated oven. By 6 in the morning, the smell of roasting meat and spices was already beginning to fill the house. I sat down for the first time for barely 5 minutes to drink some cinnamon tea and warm my hands on the mug. I looked out the window as the sky began to lighten, painting itself a pale, cold blue. There was no time to rest. The pork roast needed its own marinade, this time with dried chilies, ackiyot, cloves and pineapple juice. The routine started all over again. Chop, blend, massage, bake. At 8 in the morning, my grandkids came down. Leo, who is 7, and little Mia, who is 4. They ran into the kitchen in their pyjamas, drawn by the heat and the smells. "Smells good, Grandma," Leo yelled, hugging my legs. The exhaustion vanished for a second. That is my weakness, my eternal vulnerability. Everything I do, every burn on my arms, every ache in my back, I do for them. I made them a quick breakfast, some scrambled eggs with refried beans and warm tortillas. I sat them at the small kitchen table and watched them eat. I had knitted them some red sweaters to wear for the first time tonight. I had spent the November nights knitting in secret to surprise them. At 9, Valerie appeared. My daughter dragged her feet into the room. Wrapped in a silk robe Robert had bought her on one of his trips. Her hair was a mess, and she had a green clay mask on her face. "Mom, how are you doing with everything?" "Robert is super stressed," she told me, pouring herself coffee without looking me in the eye. "The turkey is almost done, sweetheart. The pork goes in shortly. I just need to make the desserts, the mashed potatoes, the apple salad, and the pasta," I answered, drying my hands on my apron. "Oh, that's good. It's just that today is a crucial day for him. The owners of the development firm are coming. Everything has to be perfect, Mum. Perfect. No chipped plates, okay? The deed to the house is in my name. Arthur and I built it brick by brick, but when he passed away, Robert decided it was best for them to move in here to take care of me. Over time, they changed the furniture, painted the walls cold, grey colours that I don't like, and relegated me to the back bedroom, the one facing the utility yard. I accepted it in silence. I accepted it because I come from that generation of women who believe that family peace is worth more than personal pride. I believe that by yielding, by serving, I kept the love intact. At 11 in the morning, I started on the desserts. The heat in the kitchen was already suffocating, a brutal contrast to the cold outside. I prepped the dough for the apple pie, kneading the flour with cold butter until my fingers ached. I peeled 6 pounds of apples, cutting them into thin slices, tossing them with cinnamon, brown sugar and a touch of nutmeg. Then I made the caramel for 2 large flans. The boiling sugar popped from the pot, and a drop landed right on my right forearm. I clenched my teeth, let out a sharp hiss of pain, rushed to the sink, and ran cold water over it. It left a red, throbbing blister, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. If the flan wasn't ready in time, it wouldn't set in the fridge. At 1 in the afternoon, Robert made his first appearance in the kitchen. He came in wearing designer athletic clothes, talking loudly on his cell phone, puffing out his chest. He hung up and looked me up and down. I was sweating, my white hair plastered to my forehead, stirring the pasta pot. "Eleanor," he said, dropping any title of respect. "I hope you're using the exhaust hood. I don't want the house smelling like a cheap diner when the guests arrive." "The hood is on, Robert, but I'm cooking for 20 people. It's normal for it to smell like food," I answered quietly, without stopping my stirring. "Well, open the windows, and please, hide those old enamel pots. I don't want my partners seeing that misery. Use the glass casserole dishes we bought last month." I felt a knot in my stomach, a mix of old sadness and anger, but I swallowed it. I went to open the window, and the freezing wind hit my sweaty back, making me shiver. I transferred the food to the glass containers, heavy and slippery, just as he wanted. At 3 in the afternoon, it was time to set the table, the dark wood dining sink set Arthur bought with his first big holiday bonus. I went to the hutch and pulled out the white linen tablecloth with hand embroidery that belonged to my mother. We only used it on truly special occasions. I spread it over the long table and ran the warm iron directly over the fabric to remove even the slightest wrinkle, bending my back over the table until my kidneys screamed in pain. Then I brought out the good china, the silver flatware I had to polish piece by piece with baking soda and lemon because it had grown dull from disuse. I arranged 20 plates, 20 wine glasses, 20 cloth napkins folded into fans. It took me almost 2 hours to make the dining room look like the floor of a luxury restaurant. By 5 in the afternoon, the exhaustion wasn't just physical anymore. It was a heavy fog blurring my vision. The turkey was golden, crispy, perfect. The pork roast released a thick, dark juice. The mashed potatoes were creamy, enriched with the exact amount of cream and butter. The pasta, the salads, the dressings, everything was ready. I had done it all with my 2 hands, with my time, with the wear and tear of my own bones. All that was left was to warm the bread and serve. I went to my room, that narrow little room next to the laundry area. I sat on the edge of my twin bed and took a deep breath. Every muscle in my body ached. The burn on my arm throbbed to the rhythm of my heartbeat. I looked at my dress hanging on the closet door. A burgundy dress, simple and elegant, that I had washed and ironed with care. My black low-heeled shoes were ready. I just needed 10 minutes. 10 minutes to jump in the shower, wash off the smell of garlic and onion, put on my dress, brush my white hair, and go out to welcome Christmas with my family. It was 6:30 when I heard the screaming from upstairs. "Leo, take off that hideous, itchy wool sweater. Are you going to put on the collared shirt I bought you?" It was Robert's voice. "But Grandma made it for me," the boy whined. "I don't give a damn. Put the shirt on." "Valerie, control your kids. For the love of God, my partners are about to arrive." I hadn't even showered yet, but I knew if I didn't step in, the situation would escalate, and Valerie would end up crying. I stepped out into the hallway, my dirty apron still on. I went to the kitchen to check the oven one last time. At that moment, the front doorbell rang. It was exactly 7 o'clock. They were early. Panic erupted in the house. I heard Robert's hurried footsteps coming down the stairs, buttoning the cuffs of an impeccable suit. He smelled of a strong, expensive cologne that flooded the hallway, erasing the cinnamon scent of my desserts. Valerie came down behind him in a tight black dress, high heels, and perfect makeup, pulling the kids by their hands. Leo was wearing the stiff shirt his father forced on him, his eyes red from crying. I was in the hallway connecting the kitchen to the foyer, right next to the living room. I had a kitchen rag in my hand, wiping the sweat from my forehead. I took a step forward. My intention was simple. Open the door, wish the guests a good evening with a smile, and then slip discreetly to my room for a quick change. It was my house, it was my food, it was my effort. I wanted to at least say welcome. Robert stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me. His eyes swept over me from head to toe with a disgust he didn't even try to hide. He saw my messy hair, my shiny, sweaty forehead, my apron stained with meat juice, the blister on my arm, my slippers. He saw everything I had sacrificed so he could have his perfect dinner, and the only thing he felt was shame. The doorbell rang again, this time with more insistence. Lively voices and laughter could be heard on the other side of the heavy wooden door. I took another step toward the fee. "I'll get it, Robert. Don't worry." He shoved me backward, forcing me to retreat into the shadows of the hallway leading to the kitchen. The push was hard enough to make me stumble a bit, losing my balance on my aching knees. I caught myself on the doorframe to keep from falling. "Go to sleep already. My VIP guests are arriving, and I don't want any obstacles in the living room," he yelled at me in a fury-laced whisper. His teeth clenched so the people outside wouldn't hear. I froze, the air caught in my throat. I looked into his eyes, expecting to find some trace of remorse, of hesitation. There was nothing, just an urgent need to hide me, just pure contempt. I turned my head slowly to look at Valerie, my daughter, the little girl whose scraped knees I bandaged, the one whose college tuition I paid by selling cakes, the woman for whom I had agreed to live in the back bedroom. Valerie was standing 6 feet away. She saw the shove, she heard the words, and instead of defending her mother, instead of telling her husband not to touch me, Valerie lowered her eyes to the marble floor. She pretended to adjust the collar on little Leo's shirt. She played deaf. She played blind. Her silence was a second shove, much more violent than Robert's. The doorbell rang a third time. "Go to your room, Eleanor. You've done your part. Now disappear." Robert hissed again, letting go of my shoulder and turning his back instantly, transforming his enraged face into a massive, fake smile as he walked toward the front door. "Hello, Mr. Morrison. So great to see you. Come in, come in. Welcome to our humble home." I heard Robert say with a honeyed voice, throwing the door wide open, "Right this way, please. My wife and I have prepared a spectacular dinner for you." I felt something inside me, something soft and warm that I had kept alive for years, purely out of love for my family, dry up in an instant. It was a physical sensation, as if a bucket of ice water had been dumped over the embers of my heart. All the exhaustion, all the back pain, the sting of the burn vanished, replaced by a cold, absolute clarity. They had viewed me as a servant for so long that they forgot who actually owned the house. They forgot that the turkey doesn't roast itself, that the table doesn't set itself, that the magic of this family didn't spring from Robert's bank account, but from my broken hands. They wanted me invisible. They wanted me in the shadows, operating the machinery of their perfect lives without dirtying up their picture. I looked down at my stained apron. I looked toward the kitchen, where the ovens were still hot and the food steamed in its perfect pots. Then I looked toward my room at the end of the hall. Slowly, without making a single sound, I reached behind my back. I untied the knot of the blue apron. I let the fabric fall to the floor with a soft hiss. I tossed the kitchen rag on top of it. I didn't say a single word. I didn't look back at the brightly lit living room where Valerie was taking the coats of strangers. I walked down the dark hallway, dragging my feet a little, but with my back straighter than it had been in a decade. I walked into my narrow room. I didn't turn on the light. I grabbed the cold metal doorknob and pulled the door shut. The sound of the latch clicking into place was sharp, definitive, cleanly slicing through the fake laughter coming from the living room. I sat on the bed in the dark, listening to them out there in the dining room, getting ready to serve the banquet I had built. They had no idea of the void they had just created. They didn't know that when this door closed, the engine keeping their entire world alive had just shut down forever. In the darkness of my room, the silence buzzed in my ears, but it didn't last long. Barely seconds after my door latch clicked into place, the noise from the living room began to bleed through the thin walls of my bedroom. I heard the high-pitched clinking of fine crystal touching in toasts, the deep voices of men discussing business, the rehearsed laughter of the women. I heard Robert's voice, powerful and confident, dominating the space that Arthur and I had built with so many years of sacrifice and early mornings. "A toast to new beginnings, Mr. Morrison." My son-in-law's voice echoed down the hall to my bed. "And to the partnerships that will take us to the next level. Mi casa es su casa." He said it with a mouth full of pride, giving away a space that didn't belong to him. Standing on the floor, I had polished on my hands and knees. I sat on the edge of the mattress, feeling the sharp sting of the blister on my right forearm, where the boiling caramel had splattered me hours earlier. I raised my hand in the gloom and touched the wound with my index fingertip. The pain was sharp, clean, real. It served to anchor me to the present. For the last 5 years, ever since I closed Arthur's eyes for the last time in the hospital, I had lived in a sort of voluntary lethargy. I had walked the halls of my own home asking for permission, making myself small so as not to be a nuisance, swallowing the insults with the false hope that submission would buy my daughter's love and my grandchildren's peace. But Robert's shove, that heavy hand on my shoulder, treating me like a stray dog being shooed from the door, had broken the spell. And Valerie's silence. Her gaze glued to the marble floor while her husband humiliated me, had finished sweeping away the pieces. I stood up. My knees protested with their usual dull crunch, but this time I paid them no mind. I turned on the small nightstand lamp on the cheap particle board table. The yellow light illuminated my refuge. A twin bed, a cheap wardrobe Robert had bought to replace my antique vanity, and a shoebox stacked in a corner. I walked over to the wardrobe. I opened the doors, which creaked slightly from the humidity. There, hanging on a wire hanger, was my burgundy dress. I ran my fingertips over the fabric. It was a simple cut with 3/4 sleeves and a modest neckline, but the material had a weight to it that gave me confidence. I had bought it with my savings to wear tonight, to sit at the table surrounded by my family. I took it off the hanger. I took off my worn slippers, untied the wool robe that smelled of smoke, fried onions, and lonely early mornings, and let it drop onto the unmade bed. I dressed with slow, methodical movements. I zipped up the back, feeling the fabric conform to my tired body. I sat down again to put on my black low-heeled shoes, securing the straps over my swollen insteps. I went to the small mirror hanging behind the door. I brushed my white hair, sweeping it back with a couple of dark bobby pins. I didn't put on makeup, I've never liked it, but I pinched my cheeks gently to bring some colour back to them. I didn't look sad. I looked exhausted, yes, with deep dark circles casting shadows under my eyes, but there was a new hardness in my jaw. I was no longer the frightened widow surrendering her space. I knelt beside the bed and pulled out the shoebox I kept underneath. Inside was my real life, the one they ignored. I pulled out a black leather purse, small but sturdy, that Arthur had given me for an anniversary. Into the purse went my ID, my bank card, where my modest monthly pension was deposited, the original keys to the house, and a manila envelope folded in half. Inside that envelope was the deed to the property in my name, free of any liens. Robert had never asked me for it directly, but I knew he had been hinting for months that we should regularise the paperwork to put the house in. Valerie's name, I never gave it to them. That envelope was my only invisible shield. I also tossed in Arthur's wristwatch and a silver rosary. I zipped the purse and slung it over my shoulder. The plan didn't form in my head in words, but in clear, definitive impulses. If they wanted me invisible, I would be invisible. If my presence was a hindrance to their perfect night, then I would remove my presence entirely. But I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I walked to my bedroom door and pressed my ear against the wood. The party was in full swing. The jazz music Robert always played to sound sophisticated was playing at a moderate volume. The voices were concentrated in the living room and foyer. The dining room and kitchen, located in the opposite wing, had to be deserted. I gripped the cold doorknob, turned it slowly so the latch wouldn't make a sound, and opened the door just enough to peek out. The hallway was dark. The bright, warm light was spilling from the archway connecting to the main living room. I stepped out of my room, walking on the balls of my feet so my heels wouldn't click on the hardwood floor. I walked past the living room archway without breaking my stride, but out of the corner of my eye, I caught the scene. Robert was standing by the unlit fireplace, holding a glass of whiskey on the rocks, smiling with all his teeth while talking to a grey-haired man in a flawless suit. Valerie was sitting on the white leather sofa, legs crossed, nodding at whatever the partner's wife was saying, laughing with that high, hollow laugh she reserved for strangers. My grandkids were nowhere in sight. They had probably been sent upstairs to play so they wouldn't interrupt the adult conversations. Everything was pristine. Everything was a magazine lie. I reached the swinging kitchen door and nudged it open gently with my shoulder. The temperature shift was immediate. In here, the dense heat from the recently turned off ovens still hung in the air, along with the deep aroma of spices, roasted meat and cinnamon. I only turned on the small light under the exhaust hood, leaving the rest of the kitchen in shadows to prevent light from spilling under the door into the hallway. I approached the granite centre island. There sat the heavy glass casserole dishes Robert had forced me to use. In one rested the pork roast, bathing in its dark, thick juices. In the other, immense and golden, the 22-pound turkey I had massaged, injected and baked since 4 a.m. Off to the side, covered in aluminium foil, were the 2 flans, the mashed potatoes and the apple salad. I stared at the food, my food. The ingredients for the side dishes and the pork roast had been bought by Robert, that was true. But the turkey, that giant bird that was the star of the night, I had paid for out of my own pocket. I don't have cash on me, Eleanor. You pay for it and I'll pay you back tomorrow. He had told me at the market the week before. Tomorrow never came, as was his custom. The ingredients for the desserts had also come out of my coin purse, penny by penny, bought at the corner grocery store because Valerie had forgotten to put them on her supermarket list. I opened the bottom drawers of the pantry. I didn't think twice. I pulled out 3 heavy-duty canvas tote bags, the kind I used to carry vegetables at the farmer's market. I went straight to the turkey dish. I grabbed a large metal spoon and a carving fork. Instead of taking the heavy glass that belonged to my son-in-law, I took the old blue enamel aluminium roasting pan he had ordered me to hide for, looking like misery. With a swift, expert motion, I stabbed the fork into the turkey's breast and used the boost to support it from underneath. It was incredibly heavy. My wrists shook under the strain, but anger gave me a strength I thought I'd lost. I hoisted the perfect bird and transferred it from the elegant glass to my old pot. The sound of the hot meat settling into the aluminum gave me immense satisfaction. I poured all the juices from the bottom of the glass dish over the turkey in the pot, leaving the glass completely empty and smeared with grease. I covered the roasting pan with a double layer of aluminium foil, sealing the edges tight, and shoved it into the first canvas bag. I went for the desserts. The 2 metal moulds holding the flans, cold and perfect, went into the second bag. I grabbed an airtight plastic container I kept in the cupboard and dumped all the apple salad into it, scraping the edges of the crystal bowl well to make sure I didn't leave a single walnut behind. I left the pork roast, the mashed potatoes, and the pasta untouched. After all, Robert had paid for that. Let them eat the sides. Let them celebrate their big business deals, chewing on cold pasta and pork. I was just finishing tying the handles of the canvas bags when a sharp noise froze my blood. Someone had pushed the swinging kitchen door. I turned slowly, hiding the bags behind the centre island, resting my hands on the cold granite. It was Robert. He walked briskly into the kitchen, his face flushed with alcohol and excitement, holding an empty silver ice bucket. He didn't turn on the main light. He simply walked toward the refrigerator. When he saw me standing there in the shadows, he stopped dead. His eyes ran over my burgundy dress, my clean shoes, my styled hair. His expression went from surprise to irritation in a heartbeat. "Eleanor, mind telling me why you're dressed like that?" he snapped, dropping his voice to a furious hiss, taking heavy steps toward me. "Didn't I specifically tell you to go to sleep? I don't want you hovering around here when we're eating." My pulse was pounding in my throat, but my face showed no emotion. I didn't back up a single inch. "I came for a glass of water," I replied, my voice so flat and cold I barely recognised it myself. Robert let out an impatient snort and slammed the silver ice bucket onto the granite counter. barely 2 feet away from the empty glass dishes he still hadn't noticed in the partial darkness. "Well, drink your water and get the hell back to your room," he ordered, pointing at the door with an accusing finger. "Mr. Morrison is thrilled with the house. In 10 minutes, I'm going to bring them into the dining room. Listen to me carefully, Eleanor. In 10 minutes, I'm coming back for the turkey and the food. Fill this bucket to the brim with ice and leave it here on the counter. And turn the oven on to warm up the rolls. Do not step out into the hallway for any reason. Do you understand me? I'll come get the plates myself. I don't want my guests seeing my mother-in-law waiting tables." Then I looked at him. The man sleeping under the roof my husband built, the man eating out of my pots, barking orders at me as if I were a trespasser in my own sanctuary. "Of course, Robert," I said, dragging out the words with a deliberate slowness. "I'll take care of the ice." He spun around and pushed through the swinging door, disappearing once again into the noise and lights of his fake world. I was completely alone. The clock on the kitchen wall read 8:20 p.m. He had exactly 10 minutes before the house of cards came crashing down on him. I didn't touch the ice bucket. I didn't turn on the oven. I didn't take the rolls out of their plastic bag. I grabbed the 3 heavy canvas bags by the handles. The weight of the turkey in the first bag was brutal. It forced me to lean my body to one side, straining the muscles in my neck and back. The other 2 bags, holding the flans and the salad, hung from my left arm. I walked toward the back door of the kitchen, the one leading to the small utility yard, and from there to a side alley that connected directly to the main street. It was the exit we used to take out the trash, the vendor's exit, the exit for the invisible. It was the perfect exit for me. I slid the rusty iron deadbolt back with my free hand. I turned the knob and pushed the door outward. The freezing December night air hit my face like a comforting slap. The contrast with the heat of the kitchen made me let out a long sigh. I stepped onto the concrete patio, dragging my right foot a little under the burden. I didn't lock the door with a key. I simply pushed it shut until I heard the metallic click securing it from the inside. I walked down the side alley in total darkness, guided only by the memory in my feet. When I reached the sidewalk, the yellowish glow of the street lamps lit my way. The neighbourhood was deserted. At this hour, on Christmas Eve, all the families were locked in their houses, celebrating, eating, laughing. The silence on the street was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my own footsteps on dry leaves and the soft panting of my breath. I didn't have a destination planned when I left my room, but as I walked down the cracked sidewalk of my neighbourhood, my feet took me on their own to the only place I knew the doors would be open. The parish of St. Jude was just 5 blocks from my house. It was the place where Arthur and I had gotten married, where we had baptised Valerie, and where I spent my Thursday afternoons helping out at the community pantry. The walk was physical agony. By the 2nd block, the canvas handles dug into my palms, cutting off the circulation to my fingers until they went numb. I had to stop by a street light, rest the turkey bag on a low wall, and massage my hands. The cold chilled me to the bone through the fabric of my burgundy dress. But my soul didn't feel cold. On the contrary, with every step taking me further from my own house, I felt a heavy old crust peeling off my chest. I was breathing clean air for the first time in years. I checked my wristwatch, 8:28 p.m. At that precise moment, Robert had to be pushing through the swinging kitchen door, rubbing his hands together, ready to carry the elegant glass dishes into the dining room. I could picture the scene with photographic clarity. I could see his arrogant smile freezing as he flipped on the light. I could see his eyes locking onto the empty glass containers, smeared with grease and scraps. I could hear the dead silence in that kitchen as he realised there was no turkey, no dessert, no salad, and above all, as he realised there was no mother-in-law left to scream at. A tiny, dry, razor-sharp smile formed at the corner of my lips. I hoisted the bags again and kept walking. In the distance, I saw the stone facade of the parish. The heavy wooden doors were wide open, casting a warm glow onto the courtyard. It was still several hours before the traditional midnight mass, but I knew the adjacent parish hall was always active. The women in the community organised a modest dinner for the people in the neighbourhood who didn't have family, for the lonely elderly, and the homeless who slept in the square. I climbed the 3 steps of the courtyard, my legs shaking from the effort. The weight of the food had drawn a cold sweat to my forehead, ruining my brushed hair, but I didn't care. I walked down the side corridor leading to the parish hall. The smell of fruit punch and melting wax hung in the air. As I crossed the threshold into the hall, the commotion wrapped around me. There were a couple of long plastic tables covered with shiny paper tablecloths. About 15 older people sat drinking from styrofoam cups, talking quietly. In the back, near a small makeshift kitchen, was Martha Santini. Martha was a woman my age, also a widow, with boundless energy and a commanding voice that ran the church choir. She was wearing a white apron over a thick sweater, stirring a giant pot of punch with a wooden ladle. When she saw me walk in, carrying the heavy bags, almost dragging them across the tile floor, she dropped the ladle and rushed toward me. "Holy Mother of God, Eleanor, what are you doing here at this hour? And what are you carrying that's breaking your back?" Martha exclaimed, immediately grabbing the bag, holding the turkey to take the weight off me. The relief in my arms was so profound I almost lost my balance. I leaned against the doorframe, taking deep breaths, feeling the blood start flowing back into my numb fingers. "I brought dinner, Martha," I said, my voice a little hoarse from the cold and the exhaustion. Martha frowned in confusion, hauled the heavy canvas bag to an empty table, and started untying the knot. When she opened the bag and saw the immense blue enamel roasting pan, and then slightly peeled back the aluminum foil to let the golden steam and spice aroma flood the space, her eyes went wide. "Eleanor, this is a banquet," she murmured, looking up at me. "What about your family and your daughter? You told me on Sunday you had a full house, that your son-in-law had invited the bosses from his firm." "My son-in-law said he wanted a luxury dinner, Martha," I replied, keeping my tone neutral without a single quiver in my voice. "But he forgot that luxury isn't served on empty plates, and he forgot who owns the kitchen." She didn't need me to explain the details. She saw my party dress wrinkled from the strain. She saw the black leather purse slung across my chest, holding my entire life, and she understood perfectly what I had just done. A deep, silent smile of complicity appeared on Martha's face. She nodded without asking another question. "Well, you arrived right on time, Eleanor," Martha said loudly, drawing the attention of the seniors sitting at the nearby tables. "We've got 20 people here who are going to eat like kings tonight. Bring me the knives. We're carving this turkey." I stepped up to the table, took the carving fork I had brought in the bag, and got ready to serve. Around me, the voices in the parish hall filled with awe and genuine gratitude. The human warmth immediately replaced the chill of the street. As I sliced the first piece of white meat, perfect and juicy, I heard the distant chime of the church bells striking 9 o'clock. At my house, 5 blocks away, the emotional time bomb had detonated. Robert was standing in front of a granite counter, empty-handed, staring into the absolute abyss of his own arrogance, while his VIP guests sat waiting in the dining room, about to discover that their host's castle was nothing but a hollow facade held up by the woman he had just kicked out. and I, for the first time in years, was going to eat dinner in peace. The knife glided through the turkey breast with a smoothness only achieved after hours of slow, precise cooking. The golden skin crackled under the metal blade, releasing a thick cloud of steam that smelled of white wine, oregano, and meat juices. Across from me, on the other side of the plastic table, covered with the shiny paper cloth mister, Henderson held a styrofoam plate with both trembling hands. His eyes, clouded by cataracts, were fixed on the thick slice of white meat I had just cut. With the large spoon, I scooped up some of the dark juice pooling at the bottom of my old aluminum pot and ladled it over the meat. I handed him the plate. The old man nodded without a word and walked slowly toward his folding chair. Behind him, Mrs. Higgins was already waiting her turn, clutching a paper napkin to her chest like a treasure. For the next 20 minutes, I did nothing but slice, serve, and hand out portions. Martha took charge of the desserts, unmoulding the flans onto cardboard plates, cutting exact slices so there would be enough for everyone. The parish hall, which just a half hour ago had been a cold and quiet space, was now filled with the sound of plastic utensils scraping plates, the murmur of low conversations, and the human warmth of 20 people who had expected nothing from this night. I didn't serve myself right away. I stood behind the table, resting my hands on the hard plastic edge, watching how the food that had cost me the skin on my fingers and the ache in my back disappeared into the mouths of people receiving it with reverence. No one here complained about the lack of crystal goblets. No one looked at my blue enamel pot with disgust. When the last plate was served, Martha came over to me with an insulated cup full of hot fruit punch. She pressed it into my hands and gently pushed my shoulder toward an empty chair in the corner of the hall. I sat down. The rigid plastic of the chair gave slightly under my weight. I felt the dull throbbing in my knees and the burn on the soles of my feet. But for the first time all day, I didn't feel the urge to get up and keep working. I took a sip of the punch. The sweet, hot liquid slid down my throat, loosening a knot I didn't know had been tied tight since 4 a.m. I looked at the hard seat I was resting on. That physical discomfort sent me travelling backward to a Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago. It was the day I lost my place to sit in my own home. I had gone to the farmer's market to buy groceries for the week. I walked back in a cold drizzle, carrying 4 plastic bags that cut off the circulation in my fingers. When I opened the front door, I dropped the bags on the foyer floor to shake the water off my coat. That was when I looked toward the living room. The spot by the window, the corner where the afternoon sun always hit, was empty. There was a square indentation sunk into the carpet. The only trace that Arthur's olive green recliner had ever been there, the same chair where he used to sit and read the paper, and where I would settle in to knit at night ever since he passed away. I walked into the living room, my wet shoes tracking mud on the hardwood. Robert was standing by the wall, holding a metal tape measure, typing numbers into his cell phone. I stopped in front of him. I asked him about the chair. My voice sounded small, drowned out by the sound of rain against the glass. Robert didn't even look up from the screen. I had the trash guys throw it out, Eleanor. That piece of junk smelled like old people and made the house look miserable. I'm going to buy a minimalist designer sofa for this corner. The partners from the firm can't come over and see thrift store furniture. It was the place where Arthur hugged me when we found out Valerie was pregnant. It was the piece of furniture I had reupholstered by hand to cover a tear. I turned around, looking for my daughter. Valerie was in the open kitchen with her back to us, watching a pot that was already clean. The water from the faucet was running full blast, creating a deafening roar she was using as a shield so she wouldn't have to hear me. "Valerie," I called to her from the living room. She didn't turn around. Her shoulders tensed under her silk blouse, but she didn't shut off the water. She let the noise drown out my protest. She let Robert erase the memory of her father and my only place to rest, all in the name of a minimalist sofa that I was never allowed to use. That afternoon, I picked up my grocery bags from the floor, walked to the kitchen, passed behind my daughter without touching her, and locked myself in my room. I never sat in the living room again after that day. The sound of a sharp, constant buzzing snapped me back to the present in the parish hall. It was coming from inside the black leather purse strapped across my chest. I reached in, pushing aside the manila envelope, holding the deed to my house, and pulled out the cell phone. It was a cheap device with a tiny screen that Robert had given me a year ago, claiming it was for emergencies and for me to run errands when he was at the office. The screen lit up my dark corner. The clock read 9:15 p.m. Below the time, a name flashed in large red letters, Robert. The phone buzzed against my palm like a trapped insect. I didn't answer. I just stared at the screen, watching the name disappear, replaced by a notification. 14 missed calls, 8 from Robert, 6 from Valerie. Barely 3 seconds of silence passed before the device started vibrating again. This time, the name on the screen was Valerie. Martha Santini, who was clearing some empty plates from the nearest table, noticed the glow of the phone in my hands. She walked over slowly, drying her hands on her white apron, and stopped beside me. She looked at the screen, then looked at my face. "They're calling," Martha whispered, in a tone that wasn't a question, but a simple statement of fact. "Yes," I replied, without taking my eyes off my daughter's name. "Do you want me to turn it off for you, Eleanor? I can put it in the drawer in the priest's office. That way you don't have to hear it." "I don't want to watch it ring." I could picture Robert in the kitchen, the knot of his tie undone, his face red with panic and fury, throwing open the empty ovens, staring at the greasy glass dishes, realising there was no turkey, no desserts, no magic. I could imagine Valerie locked in the guest bathroom, dialing my number over and over with trembling fingers, terrified of the public humiliation her husband was about to suffer in front of the men who were supposed to change his life. They were desperately looking for the invisible servant, but the servant wasn't there. The phone stopped ringing. The screen went dark, plunging me back into the shadows. I rested my thumb on the side button to power the device down completely, but before I could press it, a new call came in. Valerie. The glowing name tugged at the thread of my memories once again, forcing me to recall the exact moment I realised my daughter no longer saw me as a mother, but as just another piece of furniture in the house. Just like Arthur's green chair. It happened exactly 1 year ago on Christmas Eve last year. I had caught a severe case of bronchitis in early December. The cough rattled my chest in the early hours of the morning, a dry, painful sound that left me breathless. I had spent 3 days stuck in bed in my narrow room, burning with fever, sweating through the blankets. I didn't even have the strength to get up and pour myself a glass of water. It was the afternoon of December 23rd. Robert had organised a holiday toast at the house with the managers from his company. I could hear the soft music and laughter from my bedroom. My throat hurt so badly I could barely swallow. During a particularly violent coughing fit, I sat on the edge of the bed trying to force air into my inflamed lungs. The noise I made must have carried into the hallway. My bedroom door opened just a few inches. A sliver of yellow light sliced through the darkness of my room and hurt my eyes. It was Valerie. She was wearing a blue velvet dress and holding a half-empty glass of wine. I thought she was coming to bring me cough syrup. I thought she was bringing hot tea, or at least coming to ask how I felt. I reached a shaking hand out to her in the gloom. Valerie didn't step inside. She stood in the doorway, blocking the light with her body. "Mom," she whispered with tight urgency, the same tone Robert used when something bothered him. "Please, try not to cough so loud. Or put a pillow over your face. Robert's boss is in the living room and you can hear everything all the way out there. It gives a really bad impression to have someone sick in the house." Robert is very on edge. I couldn't answer because another coughing fit closed my throat. I clutched my chest, hunching over my own knees. "Thanks, Mom." "Try to get some sleep," Valerie said quickly. And without taking a single step inside, without bringing me the empty water glass on my nightstand, she pulled the door shut. The sound of the latch clicking into place was identical to the one I had made myself tonight when I left. I sat in the dark, coughing into the thick blanket to muffle the sound, feeling the cold sweat run down my neck. That night, the fever made me hallucinate a little. I dreamed Arthur was sitting at the foot of my bed, looking at me with immense sadness. When I woke up the next morning, the fever had broken, but something inside me had frozen solid forever. I got up, went to the kitchen, cooked Christmas Eve dinner in silence, and never called Valerie out on what she did. I just filed that memory away in the same place I kept Robert's insults, in the pit of my stomach. But now, watching the phone screens glow with her name, I knew the pit of my stomach was full. There wasn't room for a single drop more of contempt. The phone buzzed one last time and the call dropped. Without waiting for them to dial again, I pressed the power button on the side. The screen asked if I was sure. I tapped confirm. The device gave a little farewell vibration and the screen went pitch black. I shoved it back into the bottom of my leather purse, underneath the envelope with the deed. I looked up. The parish hall was starting to clear out. Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Higgins had gotten up and were walking slowly toward the exit, bundling up in worn jackets, saying good night to Father Thomas, who had just come in through the side door. The priest was an older man with stark white hair and a slow gait, who knew every person in the neighbourhood by their first name. He walked over to the table where Martha and I were sitting. He looked at the empty pots, the stacked plastic plates, and then he looked at me. "They tell me we dined on king's food tonight, Eleanor," Father Thomas said, his deep voice echoing off the clean walls of the hall. "The turkey was so tender, mister. Henderson didn't even have to use his dentures. It was a special recipe. Martha tells me you carried all this over by yourself." He knew the house was in my name. He knew about Arthur's passing, and he had noticed how I stopped going to Sunday Mass because Robert demanded breakfast served at exactly 9 in the morning. The old priest took his hand off my shoulder and nodded slowly. "Pride is a very tall building, Eleanor, but its foundations are very fragile. Your son-in-law built his top floor on your shoulders. When you step away, he falls. That's the law of gravity, not revenge." Outside, the street was completely dark. The cold fogged the windows. Going back to my room, that narrow space next to the laundry, meant facing Robert screaming, Valerie's manipulative whining, and their demands that I fix the disaster they had brought upon themselves. It meant going back to being the maid. "I'm not going back," I said, and saying the words out loud made them turn to stone. They were no longer a thought, they were a fact. Not tonight, not tomorrow. That house is mine, the bricks are mine, but the hell they raised inside it is theirs. Let them sit in it a while longer. You're going to take a hot shower. I'll lend you a clean nightgown, and you're going to sleep in a real bed, Martha told me. I walked over to the aluminum sink in the corner of the hall. I turned on the cold tap and started washing my old blue enamel pot. The freezing water numbed my hands instantly, but the mechanical act of scrubbing the grease with the scouring pad brought my calm back. I washed every container, every spoon, drying them with paper towels. Martha helped me pack it all into the canvas bags, which were now empty. The bags weighed nothing at all. It was almost 10 o'clock when we left the parish. Father Thomas closed the heavy wooden door behind us, locking up the hall. Martha and I walked down the sidewalk in the opposite direction of my house. The freezing December wind hit my face, but I didn't shiver. I walked with my back straight, keeping my black leather purse pressed tight against my body. Martha's apartment was only 2 blocks away. It was a modest building with peeling walls and polished concrete stairs. We walked up to the second floor in silence. Martha unlocked the door. She flipped on the light in a narrow hallway and led me to a small guest room that smelled of lavender and bleach. It had a full-size bed with a hand-knit quilt, a light wood closet, and a small window facing the interior courtyard. "The bathroom is at the end of the hall," Martha said, handing me a thick towel and a white flannel nightgown. "Take your time. The hot water takes a minute to kick in, but it gets plenty hot." There was a hard, bright, cold spark in my pupils. I turned on the shower handle and let the steam fill the bathroom. I carefully took off the burgundy dress, unzipping the back. I kicked off the shoes that were squeezing my swollen insteps. I stepped under the scalding stream of water. The impact of the heat on my cold skin made me let out a muffled groan. The water ran down my back, over my aching knees, over my tired wrists. I closed my eyes and stood perfectly still under the water for 15 minutes, letting the smell of garlic, fried onions, and early morning sweat wash down the drain. When I got out, I dried off slowly. I put on Martha's flannel nightgown, which was a little loose on me, but incredibly soft. I stepped back into the guest room. Martha had left a steaming mug of chamomile tea on the nightstand and turned on the bedside lamp. She had already retired to her own room. I sat on the edge of the bed. The black leather purse was resting on a chair by the door. I reached over, unbuckled the strap, unzipped it, and reached inside. The powered-off phone was still at the bottom, useless and silenced. My fingers brushed past it and found the manila envelope. I pulled it out. I sat back on the bed and opened the envelope under the yellow light of the lamp. I pulled out the thick sheets of paper, stamped and signed over 30 years ago. I ran my fingertip over the notary's seal and the name printed in capital letters, Eleanor Miller, sole owner. I didn't need a lawyer to understand what I was holding in my hands. I didn't need a judge to claim my space. The power didn't reside in the paper itself, but in the fact that Robert, in his boundless arrogance, had completely forgotten whose land he was standing on. He believed the money he made at his firm gave him squatter's rights in a castle that didn't belong to him. He believed I was a ghost tolerated out of charity. Tomorrow morning, that mirage would shatter. Tomorrow they would have to face the daylight, with the hangover of a ruined dinner, with the humiliation fresh in their memories, and with the irrefutable evidence that they controlled absolutely nothing. I folded the deed carefully and slid it back into the envelope. I tucked it into the black leather purse and shoved it under my pillow. I slipped between the clean sheets that smelled of lavender. The mattress was firm. The room was dead silent. I couldn't hear Robert's heavy footsteps in the hall, or Valerie's demands, or the noise of a house that was sucking my blood drop by drop. I switched off the lamp. In the dark, I curled up on my side, hugging my own body under the blankets. My muscles, tense for years, finally began to let go. As sleep overtook me, a sharp image formed in my mind. I pictured the moment the sun came up. I pictured Robert waking up in a trashed house, surrounded by dirty glass dishes and silence. believing the worst punishment had already passed with tonight's ruined dinner. He had no idea that the real blow wasn't the food I took. The real blow was the door I would open tomorrow when I went back to finish what I started. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and for the first time in half a decade, I slept straight through the night. The ray of sunlight slipping through the crack in the curtains hit me right in the eyes. I didn't know what time it was at first. My body, conditioned for decades to snap awake like a spring in the pitch black of 4 a.m, was steeped in a heaviness. A warm lethargy that kept me pinned to the mattress. I wiggled my fingers under the knit quilt. My joints ached, a dull reminder of yesterday's titanic effort. But the pain in my chest, that constant tightness that cut off my air every time I heard Robert's footsteps in the hall, was completely gone. I turned my head toward the nightstand. Martha's little alarm clock read 9:15 m. 9:15. It had been at least 30 years since I had seen the morning sun from a bed. I sat up slowly. The white flannel nightgown brushed against the blister on my right forearm, pulling a small hiss from my lips. The caramel burn was red and throbbing, but I didn't care anymore. It was a war wound, the last mark that kitchen would ever leave on my skin. I planted my bare feet on the clean linoleum floor of the guest room. There was no rush. Nobody was yelling at me that the coffee was cold. Nobody was demanding I iron a shirt or hide my old pots. The silence in Martha's apartment was a peaceful silence, vastly different from the tense, venomous silence of my own house. I stood up, slipped into my black, low-heeled shoes and walked to the door. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and buttered toast filled the narrow hallway. I headed into the small kitchen. Martha was sitting at the table in wool slacks and a grey sweater, reading an old newspaper with her half-moon reading glasses balanced on the tip of her nose. In front of her sat 2 steaming mugs and a plate of sweet bread. "Morning, sleepyhead," Martha said without looking up from the paper, but with a clear smile in her voice. "I thought I was going to have to go check your pulse. You slept like a rock." Her dark eyes held a gleam of complicity mixed with pure amusement. She rested her elbows on the table and leaned toward me, dropping her voice as if someone might overhear us. "The neighbourhood group chat was pinging until 2 in the morning, Eleanor murmured, tapping her cell phone, which sat next to the bread plate. "Ernest, the night watchman on your block, saw the whole thing. He sent me a private message at midnight because he knows we're friends. He said your son-in-law's VIP guests started leaving the house at 8:45 p.m. They weren't even there a full hour. Ernest says the grey-haired guy, the boss your son-in-law was trying to impress, Power walked out to his black SUV," Martha continued, gesturing with her hands. The guy's wife was right behind him, red-faced with fury, buttoning up her coat. Your son-in-law ran all the way out to the sidewalk in his shirt sleeves, begging them to stay, claiming there had been a mix-up with the catering service, that they could order food from a restaurant. Ernest says the grey-haired man stopped dead, looked him up and down, and yelled at him right there in the street. A man who seats me at his table with empty plates and lies to my face about an imaginary banquet is not a man I'm going to trust with my company's money. They got in the SUV and left him standing there, freezing on the sidewalk. It wasn't a laugh of joy, but the release of immense pressure. Robert had built his own gallows. I had simply refused to weave the rope that held him up. He had tried to sell an image of perfection, an illusion of absolute control, but that illusion required my constant sweat, my perfect invisibility. By removing my presence, the house of cards hadn't just fallen, it had crushed him in front of the only people he cared about. "And your daughter?" Martha asked, softening her tone, watching my reaction. "Valerie picked her side a long time ago, Martha," I answered, staring into the dark bottom of my mug. Yesterday, she watched me get humiliated and stared at the floor. Today she'll have to stare at the mess that's left behind. I'm going to the house, I announced to Martha from the hallway. She poked her head out of the kitchen, frowning. Are you sure, Eleanor? That man must be like a rabid dog right now. If you want, I'll call my son to go with you. I just want to see with my own eyes what happens when the invisible maid actually disappears. I looked at the Christmas decorations in the neighbours' windows, the dead lights, the fireworks debris on the asphalt. The whole world seemed to be sleeping off the holiday hangover. Everyone except house number 42. I reached the side alley of my property. The service door I had pushed shut the night before was exactly the same. No one had bothered to slide the deadbolt. No one had even realised which way the turkey had gone out. I pushed the rusted metal and stepped onto the small concrete patio. I opened the back door and walked into the kitchen. The visual impact was immediate, but the smell was worse. The kitchen, my spotless sanctuary of white tiles, looked like it had been ransacked. The air reeked of stale alcohol, cigarette smoke and desperation. I flipped on the fluorescent ceiling light. The granite centre island was covered in half-empty crystal glasses, empty wine bottles, and sticky puddles of spilled liquor that had already dried. In the centre of the counter, like monuments to stupidity, sat the massive glass dishes Robert had forced me to use. They were dirty, smeared with turkey grease and apple salad juice, but completely empty. The floor was covered in breadcrumbs. Someone, probably Robert in his blind panic, had tried to yank the raw crescent rolls out of their plastic bags, but had left them half-baked, abandoned on a baking sheet, now tilted precariously over the sink. There were cigarette ashes in the butter dish. The trash can was overflowing with crumpled, stained fine linen napkins. I walked through the disaster, feeling my shoes stick slightly to the filthy floor. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the overwhelming urge to grab a mop and start cleaning. I felt a deep, cold satisfaction. This was their true survival capacity. This was what they achieved when my hands weren't there to fix their mistakes before anyone noticed. I stopped in front of the swinging door leading to the hallway. From upstairs, the sound of raised voices began to filter down. They were muffled by the distance, but loaded with a venomous fury. I told you to control her, Valerie. I told you to keep her locked in her damn room. It was Robert's voice. He sounded hoarse, scratchy, bordering on hysteria. She ruined me. Morrison blocked my number this morning. He told me I'm a clown, a starving beggar who can't even afford decent catering. Eat off my dime, he barked. And the sound of something heavy smashing against the master bedroom wall made the ceiling vibrate over my head. And look at us now. The development contract went in the garbage. My partners think I'm bankrupt because I served them cold bread and cheap wine at an empty table. Make her come back. Call her right now and tell her to come clean up this pigsty before my parents get here at noon. He wanted the invisible machinery to fire back up because he was entirely incapable of operating his own life. I pushed the swinging door with an open palm and stepped into the foyer. The dining room was worse than the kitchen. My mother's white linen tablecloth, the one I had ironed with such care, was stained with red wine. Crystal goblets were scattered everywhere. The wooden chairs were pushed out of place, some knocked over. It looked like the scene of a frantic escape. I started walking toward my bedroom at the end of the hall. My footsteps echoed sharply on the hardwood. I didn't bother tiptoeing. I didn't bother hiding my presence. The click of my heels reached the second floor. The voices cut off instantly. There was a heavy, expectant silence, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps coming down the marble staircase. I reached my bedroom door, But before I could turn the knob, Robert's voice boomed behind me. Eleanor! His eyes were bloodshot, bulging from lack of sleep and pent-up rage. Behind him, coming down the last few steps, was Valerie. She was wearing a wrinkled silk robe, her mascara running down her cheeks, her eyes swollen from crying. Robert closed the distance in 3 heavy strides. He stopped 3 feet away from me, invading my personal space, puffing out his chest in a pathetic attempt to regain the authority he had lost the night before. "Where the hell were you?" he spat, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Do you have any idea what you did? Do you have any idea of the humiliation you put me through in front of the most important man in the city?" I observed him with the same clinical detachment one uses to watch a bug thrashing on its back. "You asked me not to be an obstacle, Robert," I said, in a voice so calm and level it seemed to destabilise him even more. "You screamed at me in front of my daughter to disappear, that I had done my part and to get out. Never in all these years have I been so obedient." He clenched his fists at his sides. "You stole the food, my food. I paid for those ingredients. If you weren't capable of serving cold pork roast on your crystal plates, that's your problem, not mine. Clean the living room. Robert's parents are coming at 1 to reheat the dinner, and we have nothing. Help us fix this," begging me to clean up her husband's filth, to keep up appearances for her in-laws. I looked my daughter up and down. I saw the running mascara, the expensive robe, the absolute uselessness of her French manicured hands. "You are their mother, Valerie," I told her, my words slicing through the cold hallway air like razor blades. "You have 2 perfectly healthy hands. Go into the kitchen, get a frying pan, and make your children breakfast. And if the house is dirty, grab a broom. You're old enough to know how this works. Don't talk to my wife like that," Robert interjected, taking another step toward me, trying to use his size to intimidate me. "You don't give orders here. Look at yourself. You look like a tramp in those borrowed clothes. You're going to march into that kitchen right now. You're going to take out the trash. You're going to set the dining room. And you're going to cook something for my parents. And if you don't, I swear to God, Eleanor, tomorrow morning I'll pack up your crap and dump you in a nursing home.
Thank you so much for
This is
being
my
here.
house,
Your support
and under my
means
roof,
the world to
things
me.
are done the way I say.
Thank you so
I
much
didn't pull the
for being
manila
here.
envelope out of my
Your
purse.
support means the world
I didn't
to
show
me.
him the notary signatures.
Thank you so much
I didn't
for
need to
being here.
lower
Your
myself to argue
support means
property
the
law
world to me.
with a man who didn't even know how to sweep up his own mess. His punishment wasn't losing the property deed. His punishment was having to live in it without me. "Don't worry about packing my things, Robert," I answered, turning around and opening my bedroom door. I already did. Robert and Valerie remained paralysed in the same spot, watching me with a mix of disbelief and mounting panic. The sharp wail of my grandson, Leo, drifted down the stairs. "Mom, I'm hungry. Mia spilled milk on the rug," the boy yelled from the 2nd floor. Valerie shrank at the sound of the shout, looking upstairs and then back at me with pleading eyes. "Where are you going, Mum? You can't leave us like this. You can't. Go look for pity somewhere else. We don't need you. I can hire 3 maids better than you tomorrow morning." "Maybe you can afford 3 maids. Robert," I told him, keeping my voice low, making sure every syllable nailed itself into the silence of the hallway. "But nobody is going to give you back the contract you lost yesterday, and nobody is going to give your guests back the respect they lost for you when they saw you're nothing but a hollow man surrounded by empty plates. You didn't kick me out of your dinner. You freed me from your misery." I grabbed the brass handle of the heavy wooden front door, turned it, pulled the door toward me, and stepped out onto the small front porch. The freezing Christmas morning wind wrapped around me instantly, tossing my white hair, but the black leather purse pressed against chest gave me a profound warmth. I didn't pull the door shut gently. I yanked it hard, letting the slam echo through the entire house, a definitive crash that rattled the window panes. As I walked down the stone path to the sidewalk, I heard the unmistakable sound of something glass shattering against the floor inside the house, followed by Robert's frustrated, desperate scream and Valerie's uncontrollable sobbing. The chaos had just begun. The invisible machinery had been unplugged forever, and the vacuum it left in its wake was big enough to swallow them whole. They were left trapped in the hell of their own incompetence, with the in-laws about to arrive at a filthy house, with no food, no contract, and no maid. And I, with my aching knees and my borrowed dress, walked down the empty street, feeling for the first time in my entire life absolutely invincible. The walk back to Martha's apartment was one of the strangest and most revealing strolls of my entire life. The freezing Christmas morning wind hit me head on, slipping down the collar of my borrowed coat, but it didn't make me shiver once. With every step I took on the cracked neighbourhood sidewalks, the echo of the door I had just slammed resonated in my memory, a sharp, heavy, crushing sound that had put an end to a whole decade of silence and submission. My black low-heeled shoes, the same ones I had polished so meticulously for a party I was never invited to, made a rhythmic, steady click against the asphalt strewn with dry leaves. My soul didn't feel cold. The black leather purse, strapped firmly across my chest, beat against my ribs like a second heart. Inside it, I carried my identity, my freedom, and the irrefutable proof that the ground Robert walked on with such arrogance was mine. The streets were completely deserted. The remnants of Christmas Eve fireworks stained the pavement with grey patches of burnt powder. As I passed the neighbours' windows, I could see the blinking lights of Christmas trees flashing inside warm, tidy living rooms where families were surely sleeping off the hangover of a happy night. I didn't have a family like that. Mine had turned into a nest of demands and contempt, a theatre of appearances propped up by my sweat. But as I turned the corner and lost sight of the facade of my own house, I felt a massive crust peel off my back. I no longer had to cook for anyone who didn't say thank you. I no longer had to shrink myself in the hallways of my own home. I reached Martha's building and climbed the polished concrete stairs with an agility I hadn't felt in years. When I opened the apartment door, the smell of fresh coffee and buttered toast welcomed me back. Martha was still in the small kitchen, washing the breakfast dishes. When she heard the deadbolt slide, she quickly dried her hands on her apron and stepped into the hallway, looking me up and down, eyes wide, as if she expected to see me covered in wounds. "What happened, Eleanor?" she asked, stepping close to grab me by the elbows. "Did that animal do something to you? You're pale." "He didn't do a thing to me, Martha," I answered, feeling a tiny, involuntary smile tug at the corners of my lips. "The kitchen is a dumpster. The crystal dishes he forced me to use are stained and empty in the middle of the counter." Robert was losing his mind, screaming that he lost the contract of a lifetime because his boss humiliated him in front of his wife. What did Valerie do? A 35-year-old woman crying because she doesn't know how to turn on the stove to make breakfast for her own kids. The shamelessness of those people knows no bounds. Slammed the door and left them alone in their own hell. My knees ached, my lower back ached, and the blister on my right forearm, where the boiling caramel had landed, popped and formed a dark scab that Martha treated with healing ointment every night. The cheap cell phone Robert had given me stayed powered off and buried at the bottom of my leather purse. I didn't care to know how many times they had called. I didn't care to hear the threats or the pleading. My absence was my only answer. On December 28th, I finally put on my shoes and went out. I didn't go to church or the market. I went straight to the municipal utility offices. For years, ever since Arthur was alive, all the bills for the house were in my name. The electric, the water, the gas, and even the high-speed internet package Robert demanded for his business video calls were all auto-drafted from my bank card. From the pension Arthur had left me, Robert never offered to pay them, and I, in my effort to keep the peace, never demanded he do so. I walked into the first office, the electric company. I pulled a paper ticket and waited in a hard plastic chair. When the clerk at the window called my number, I handed her my ID and the account number. "I want to cancel the autopay, miss," I told her with a steady voice, "and I want to disconnect the service in my name. I no longer live at that address. If my presence was a burden, then my money and my signature were too." From that moment on, house number 42 would have to run on the dime of the man who thought he owned it. The months began to pass with a sweet, restorative slowness. I stayed living with Martha. We agreed to split the apartment expenses, and to bring in a little extra cash, we started baking together. I no longer prepped 20-pound turkeys for arrogant businessmen. We baked sweetbreads, pineapple empanadas, vanilla conchas, and pecan cookies that we sold to the neighbours and outside Sunday Mass at St. Jude's. Cooking stopped being an act of slavery and went back to being what it was when Arthur was alive, an act of love and self-sustenance. It was mid-April, almost 4 months after that Christmas Eve, when the news finally caught up with us in an inevitable way. Martha and I were sitting on a bench in the parish courtyard, arranging our pastry baskets covered with white cloth napkins, when we saw Ernest approaching. He was the night watchman for the neighbourhood where my house was located, an older man, skinny as a wire, who spent his nights walking the streets with a flashlight and a thermos of coffee. Ernest took off his faded cap when he saw us and sat on the edge of the stone planter across from us. I offered him a freshly baked pineapple empanada. He took it with rough hands, took a huge bite, and chewed slowly before speaking. "Oh, Eleanor, you don't know what a disaster your house is," Ernest started, brushing the crumbs from his grey moustache. "Since you left, that property looks abandoned. The grass in the front yard completely dried up. It's yellow, dead. Nobody waters it. The trash bags pile up on the curb because Mr. Robert got into a fight with the garbage men. He yelled at them that they were starving beggars and refused to tip them. So now the trucks just drive right past and don't pick up a thing. The stray dogs tear the bags open at night and the alley reeks. But that's not the worst part," Ernest continued, lowering his voice and leaning in, adopting the confidential tone of neighbourhood gossip. "In early February, the electric company cut their power. I saw them. The yellow truck pulled up and they pulled the meter. Mr. Robert ran out in his boxes, screaming at the workers, but they told him the bill was 3 months past due. They spent 4 days in the dark lighting candles until your daughter Valerie had to go pawn some jewellery to pay the reconnection fee and the new deposit. Mr. Morrison, the guy who went to the Christmas dinner and left fuming, made sure to close every door in town on him. He badmouthed him to all the partners at the development firm. They fired him in mid-January. Now, Mr. Robert drives around in a compact car selling insurance on commission. The brand new SUV your daughter was driving got repossessed by the dealership because they stopped making payments. They spend all day screaming. You can hear the fights from the street. They just blame each other for everything. I gave Ernest 2 more empanadas, and he said his goodbyes, fading into the crowd starting to arrive for the 6 o'clock Mass. The final test came in late August. on a hot afternoon when the sky threatened to unleash a summer storm. I was in the small parish hall putting away the empty baking sheets when I heard the sound of heels dragging across the tile floor. I looked up. It was Valerie. I stood completely still, clutching an aluminum tray to my chest. My daughter stopped in the doorway. It took me several seconds to process the change in her appearance. She was no longer wearing silk dresses or designer shoes. She had on faded jeans and a wrinkled cotton blouse. Her hair, once perfectly dyed and flat-ironed, showed 3 inches of dark roots and was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her hands, gripping the strap of a cheap purse, had short, unpolished nails, the edges bitten down from anxiety. She looked 10 years older. "Hi, Mum," Valerie whispered, her voice so fragile it threatened to break at any moment. "Hello, Valerie," I replied without moving from my spot. I didn't put the tray down. I didn't run to hug her. The woman standing in front of me had allowed me to be humiliated in my own home, and the damage of her silence couldn't be erased by a sad face. Valerie took 2 steps into the hall. She looked around, noticing the smell of burnt sugar and cinnamon hanging in the air. The exact same smell I used to leave in her kitchen every morning before they kicked me out. "I've been looking for you," she said, swallowing hard. "I went to Martha's house several times, but she always told me you weren't there or shut the door in my face. I need to talk to you, Mum, please. Robert hasn't a steady job in months. The money he makes from commissions barely covers groceries. The kids had to be pulled out of private school and put into public school. The house is falling apart. The water heater broke and we don't have the money to fix it. We've been taking bucket baths with cold water for weeks. We're 2 months behind on property taxes and the credit cards are eating us alive." I let her empty her sack of miseries, listening to every detail of the ruin they had built themselves. She looked at me with those big, wet eyes, waiting for maternal instinct to make me run to her with an open wallet, just as I had done so many times in the past. "We need your signature, Mom," she finally blurted out, getting to the real reason for her visit. She took another extending a shaking hand toward me. "We need you to sign over power of attorney or put the deed in Robert's name. If the house is in our name, we can mortgage it or sell it to pay off the debt and start a new business. I promise we'll give you a cut. I promise everything will be different." Robert learned his lesson. "He's so sorry. Please, Mom, don't leave us out on the street for your grandchildren's sake." It was the same hand that hadn't moved an inch to defend me when her husband shoved me into the dark hallway. It was the hand of the woman who asked me to put a pillow over my face to muffle my coughing so I wouldn't bother her guests. The sheer nerve of coming to ask me for the deed to the house Arthur and I built, just to pay off the debts of her husband's arrogance, felt like a sick joke. "No," I said. It was a short, dry, absolute word. It dropped into the parish hall with the weight of a granite tombstone. Valerie blinked in confusion, slowly pulling her hand back. "No, Mum, I'm telling you we're going to lose everything. I'm begging you. You have nothing to mortgage because it never belonged to you." Robert thought yelling louder made him the owner, and you believed him. But the papers are still in my purse. I'm not signing anything. I'm not signing away your father's legacy to save a man who treated me like garbage. You want to see us on the street? You want your grandkids sleeping under a bridge? At the end of the month, I'm putting my house on the market. With the money, I'm going to buy a small place for myself, and the rest I'll put in a college trust for Leo and Mia for when they're older. They will never go without. But I am not giving the 2 of you a single red cent. She realised in that exact moment that the submissive mother, the invisible maid who quietly solved all their problems, had died on Christmas Eve. The woman standing in front of her was not going to back down. She turned around, her shoulders slumped, her face twisted in tears, and dragged her feet out of the hall, exactly the way I had done when they kicked me out of my own kitchen. And so it was. 3 weeks later, a cheap moving truck hauled away Robert's minimalist furniture, flat-screen TVs, and designer clothes. Ernest told me they left in the dead of night with their heads down, rushing the suitcases in so the neighbours wouldn't see them. They left the kikis under the front mat. I hired a real estate agency. I cleaned the house with Martha's help. I scrubbed the wine stains out of the dining room, fixed the yard, and sold it 2 months later to a large family with 3 dogs who filled the patio with noise and life. It has been almost 3 years since that Christmas. The leap in time healed the physical wounds and erased the chronic exhaustion from my bones. With the money from the sale, I didn't buy a dark apartment or a back room on someone else's property. I bought a small, single-storey house in a quiet neighbourhood on the south side of the city. It was a modest house with large windows that let the sunlight in from dawn, and a backyard where I planted rose bushes and pots of mint. Martha moved in with me. We became business partners and life companions. We turned the spacious living room into our own baking studio. Now we bake to order for local coffee shops and neighbourhood events, working at our own pace, with no screaming, no rushing, and no one demanding we hide our tools. My new kitchen is my true castle. The tiles are a light blue that gleams in the morning sun. There are no heavy crystal dishes or cold granite islands. There are pine wood tables, flour-dusted rolling pins, and shelves lined with jars of spices I dehydrate in the sun myself. My knees hardly hurt anymore because I sit down to rest whenever my body asks me to, without feeling an ounce of guilt. It's Tuesday afternoon. The weather outside is crisp, announcing the arrival of winter. I'm standing at my stove, stirring the contents of a pot. It's not just any pot. It's the old blue enamel aluminum roasting pan, the exact same one I used to carry the turkey out that night, the one Robert called Misery. Inside it, the boiling caramel for the flan's bubbles with a thick, sweet sound, releasing steam that smells of vanilla and toasted sugar. My hands move nimbly, without pain. The white scar on my right forearm is barely noticeable now, blending in with the natural wrinkles of my age. I turn off the burner, grab the enamel pot by its thick handles, and move it to the table with a smooth motion. I wipe my hands on my white apron, immaculate, without a single stain of someone else's grease. I walk to the brightest corner of my living room, right next to the large window overlooking the garden. There, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon, rests an olive-green recliner. It isn't Arthur's. That one was lost to the garbage a long time ago, but it is an identical one that I hunted for in 10 different stores until I found it. I sit down slowly. The soft cushion gives way under my weight, embracing my tired back with absolute comfort. I stretch my legs out, close my eyes, and listen to the silence. There are no urgent phone calls, no heavy footsteps coming down the stairs, no voices demanding perfection. All you can hear is a bird singing in the rosebush and the distant bubbling of the caramel cooling in my kitchen. I smile in the fading light, take a deep breath, and finally rest in my own home. This presentation, its insights, and the accompanying reflections are provided strictly for educational and informational purposes. The analysis presented is based on a narrative perspective designed to foster personal growth, encourage healthy emotional boundaries, and promote humanistic values. It does not constitute formal legal, financial, or professional psychological counselling, the silent anchor. Reclaiming self-worth and human dignity. Please note from the outset that the story of Eleanor and the insights we draw from it are created purely for educational purposes, serving as a powerful lens through which we can evaluate our own lives, choices, and boundaries. When we listen to Eleanor's journey, we are not just listening to the struggles of a 68-year-old grandmother baking bread in the freezing, cold dawn. We are listening to the universal voice of anyone who has ever made themselves small so that someone else could stand tall. Eleanor represents a generation taught to believe that family peace is worth more than personal pride, a belief that often leads to a dangerous, silent compliance. For a decade, she poured her sweat, her memories, and the very health of her aching joints into sustaining a household that chose to treat her as an invisible servant rather than the foundational pillar she truly was. The turning point of this narrative arrives not with a grand shout, but with a disrespectful shove in a dark hallway, a moment where the illusion of family harmony shatters completely. When her son-in-law Robert hid her away to impress his wealthy associates, and her own daughter Valerie looked down at the floor in complicit silence, Eleanor experienced a profound, icy awakening. This moment offers a vital lesson for all of us listening today. Keeping the peace at the expense of your own dignity is not an act of love. It is an act of self-sabotage. When you continuously allow people to take your labour for granted, you inadvertently teach them that your feelings do not matter and that your presence is merely infrastructure for their convenience. By quietly untying her blue apron, packing the turkey she paid for, and walking out into the cold December night, Eleanor did something revolutionary. She withdrew the unseen engine, keeping their superficial world alive. Her journey to the parish hall to feed the lonely and the homeless demonstrates where true human value belongs. It belongs where it is received with reverence, gratitude, and genuine contrition, not where it is hidden away like an embarrassing secret. When Eleanor turned off her phone and left her family to face the hollow emptiness of their own making, she proved that the magic of a home does not spring from a wealthy bank account or a polished exterior, but from the love and dignity of the hands that build it. A perspective on human value, when we look closely at this narrative, we see a striking reflection of how easily society overlooks the silent anchors of our lives. True human dignity is not something we should ever have to beg for in our own homes. Far too often, we confuse endurance with love, assuming that absorbing pain silently will eventually buy us respect. However, boundaries are not walls built out of hatred. They are gates that protect our sacred self-worth from being trampled. It takes immense courage to realise that walking away from toxicity is not an act of revenge, but a necessary act of survival. We must understand that those who use our kindness as a carpet will always complain when we finally stand up. True wealth lies not in hollow titles or pristine leather couches, but in the warmth of a peaceful conscience and genuine human connection. Life teaches us that when you become completely invisible to the people you serve, your absence becomes your most powerful voice. It is vital to recognise when a space no longer honours your presence, because staying there only deepens the erosion of your spirit. Eleanor reminds us that it is never too late to reclaim your narrative, reshape your destiny, and demand the respect you earned. Generational compliance should never override your basic right to be treated with absolute decency and honour. True love does not require you to mute your own voice or hide your scars just to make someone else look perfect. When you finally stop holding up a world that refuses to see you, you allow the true weight of reality to humble those who took you for granted. Ultimately, A beautiful life is built on mutual appreciation, soft laughter, and the quiet comfort of knowing your hands are clean. May we all find the strength to untie the aprons of our unappreciated sacrifices and finally rest in a sanctuary of our own making. Turning the page to a better life ultimately, this educational narrative challenges us to look at our own lives and ask ourselves who we are holding up at the expense of our own well-being. It reminds us that true invincibility does not come from dominating others, but from possessing a quiet clarity about your own worth. When Eleanor stood her ground, refused to sign away her late husband's legacy, and allowed the natural consequences of Robert and Valerie's arrogance to unfold, she wasn't seeking revenge. She was practicing the ultimate form of self-care. Let this story be a gentle yet firm reminder to every listener that your time, your effort, and your dignity are sacred treasures. We must learn that it is acceptable to say no, to step back, and to let a hollow house of cards collapse if it refuses to recognise the foundation keeping it upright. May we all have the courage to step out of the shadows, speak our truth without guilt, and finally rest peacefully in a sanctuary of our own making, knowing that our worth is absolute.